Now we have over 20 participants now. Maybe I can just start from here and then we'll pace it slowly and get things started. So let me introduce myself. I am Ronald Chan. I am the president of the Hong Kong Alumni Club. And here with me today is my colleague, Alan Lee, also from Hong Kong, and three professors, Professor Bhatia, Professor Statler, and Shakeir. They are all now dialing in from New York. And let me begin with why this interview came about. About 3 months ago, I read an article by Professor Bhatia and Statler and Taylor Phillips. The three of them wrote an article called "Our 20th Century Thinking is Outdated." Now, since I grew up in the 20th century, I went to NYU in the 90s, and I was worried because my thinking from what I learned at NYU might be outdated. So I quickly called up the professor and I said, look, I gotta talk to you. I need to kind of learn about what I should equip myself with in the 21st century. And that's really how this interview came about. And I think in the next 20-30 minutes, the professors will share with them their viewpoints of how we should equip ourselves in the 21st century. And I think there are there's an acronym that we must remember here. It's VUCA, V-U-C-A. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And in order to navigate in this VUCA environment, we need to think differently in the 21st century. So that's really how the whole dialogue began between myself and the professors. And voila, here we are with this webinar. Now, before we begin, perhaps let me introduce the professor and then we'll start from there. So first, may I introduce Professor Ashish Bhatia. He is a clinical associate professor of management and entrepreneurship and the academic director of the Bachelor of Science in Business, Technology, and Entrepreneurship at NYU Stern. Professor Bhatia has had an entrepreneurial career. Prior to his current role, he served as an assistant dean of students, engagement, and innovation, where he led student life, career, and professional development and leadership development for over 2,700 undergraduates. He was also a market economist and policy advisor for 15 years, working as a portfolio manager at Federal Reserve Bank of New York and director of central banks and public policy at the World Gold Council. Professor Bhatia is an alumnus of NYU Stern Undergraduate College, and he received his Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He also has a doctorate in education from UPenn. And Alan, would you also like to introduce the other two professors?
Yes, I can start by talking about how 20th century I am, but however, I told my children that if they are lucky, they will live to see the 22nd century. But anyway, we take over, right? Professor Matt Statler joined NYU Stern as a clinical assistant professor of management and organizations in July 2009. He serves as the Richmond Family Director of Business Ethics and Social Impact Program for Stern's undergraduate college, leading and coordinating the 4-course Social Impact core curriculum, as well as a range of co-curricular and extracurricular activities. Prior to joining NYU Stern, Professor Statler served as the Director of Research for NYU Center for Catastrophe Preparedness and Response, where he coordinated research activities of the center's multiple projects while conducting original research focused on ethics of crisis management. Professor Statler earned his BA in philosophy and Spanish literature from the University of Missouri at Columbia, his PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Reima Shakeir is an international scholar, published author, and a nonprofit executive at the Emma Rothschild Foundation, where she works with a network of leaders for social change for minority communities in Europe and North America. She currently teaches organizational communication and business and society courses at NYU Stern She also teaches methodology as part of the Chief Learning Officer Executive Doctorate Program at the University of Pennsylvania. The program cultivates scholar practitioners who know how to develop and implement evidence-based practice that support formal and informal human capital leadership and skills development on demand, just in time, and longer-term learning and development initiatives within organizations. Now, with the introduction done, I would like to pass the stage to the three guest speakers here today. Bring us into the 21st century, please. One more time.
Well, thank you, Ronald and Alan and Chin, for extending this invitation. As you said, Professor Statler and I, Matt and I, and Taylor Phillips were able to author this paper on telling you that your 20th century thinking is outdated. The good news is that we also offered up a solution. And so that's what we want to talk about today. I'm grateful that our colleague Reima Shakeir was able to join us. While she hadn't authored the paper, this is something that she does in her work. And so we were really excited to make sure that we practiced what we preached and are trying to include additional people to help voice some of the solutions to the challenges that we all face with our outdated thinking. So to kick off, what do we mean by this? What was our point here? And I think to any casual observer, you just look back at the last 20, 25 years and you think, wow, this has been a lot going on, right? From the geopolitical crisis from 9/11 and ensuing, world wars that we've seen, the great financial crisis that has created such financial pain across the world, as well as dramatic change, and then what we're living through today. We're living through global pandemic that is going into its third year, and so I think it's very easy for us to say, oh, look, there's this VUCA concept, and say that the world is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous, and simply just say that this time is different, the world is different. But the reality is, or what our evidence shows, is that what might be the case is actually it might be our thinking that is actually outdated. It's not that the world is any more complex. The world has always been complex. It's always been uncertain. It's always been ambiguous. But maybe what we're doing is trying to use the mindset that we've developed in the 1900s to the 2000s, when we actually need to be thinking using more of a 21st century, or even a 22nd century perspective. And so it's important to understand where that concept has come from. And so business schools came about in the early 1900s. And actually, as alumni from NYU Stern, including myself, we should be quite proud. NYU Stern is one of the oldest business schools founded in the early 1900s. And at that time, it was a shift from the apprentice style learning, which was very popular in the 1800s. And there was a strong need for creating a managerial class that could quickly help with the economic development that was really required in the early 1900s. So we have railroads, we have factories. And at that time, it was this idea that was brought to us from Frederick Taylor, scientific management idea. And it was a great idea, and it was an important idea that helped to transform these types of operations, as rapid development that we needed, which was how can we optimize our outputs by carefully managing our inputs, right? And this is kind of an operational challenge that many of us probably learned in our various classes. And what we're seeing today now is that many of the problems that we're trying to solve, while this tool, this scientific management tool, was very effective to helping us solve so many problems over the 20th century, it's starting to kind of not work as well as we thought. And I'm going to pass it to Professor Statler to kind of elucidate a little bit more on this and to frame out where we see the role of imagination, inclusion, and judgment.
Thanks, Ashish. And maybe just quickly again, if you assume that business problems are like math problems and you can use mathematics exclusively to solve them, sometimes that works. The rise of big data strategies illustrates the way that those mathematical tools can still evolve. It's not like the project of scientific management is done. It's just that if you assume that all business problems are like math problems with an optimization solution, then quickly you'll confront the challenges that arise when the math doesn't add up, or when the math leads you to a conclusion that is, for other reasons, unacceptable. Just because we can collect, iris scans of everybody and put those in a database and predict movements, is that a good idea? Well, maybe not. So where the math doesn't add up, right, or where the math leads you to a conclusion which you can't accept for other reasons, then what do? That's where what we're advocating for, the solution that we've proposed in this paper. You need different people. You need to include different people who have different perspectives, right? Often those perspectives come with different sort of ethical or moral values, political values. You need to include people with different values in the conversation. And then what do? Maybe you need to come up with a solution that has never before existed. And math can't point you to that necessarily. You need to imagine new possibilities for thinking and action. And that's how we arrive at this imagination, inclusion, and qualitative judgment as a way to talk about the different values that need to be brought to bear on business practice and business decision making. Is that, Ashish, is that a fair summary of how we've arrived?
Yeah, that's perfect. And so what we want to do now is just take the three parts in turn, right? So I'm going to talk briefly about imagination. Then my colleague Matt's going to talk a bit about, then my colleague Reima is going to talk about inclusion, and then we'll move to Matt to talk a bit about qualitative judgment, and then we'll take some time for some questions. And so when we think about imagination, I think, for folks in Asia right now that are, maybe a manager, you're thinking like Ronald, like, hey, I was also educated in the 20th century. Where's my thinking? Where are the limitations to my thinking? And I think what we've learned in the 20th century to do really well, and we continue to teach really well in business schools, is how to reduce problems very quickly, right? How to quickly converge on some sort of solution. And in my research and teaching, I tend to emphasize two particular tools that focus in on imagination. The first is divergent thinking. So instead of focusing on how quickly we can reduce a problem towards a solution, we need to actively expand the scope of the problem and expand the scope of the solution set. So it might feel like a little silly to practice something like imagination in your work, but we're seeing increasingly managers talking about this. It was a study recently done by Boston Consulting Group, BCG, where they were talking about how in the workplace, managers need to be more effective in playing games and even doing some silly imagination exercises, because they help us move our thinking, our problem-solving abilities more laterally. Instead of just trying to go vertically and linearly down, you're now starting to imagine other ways of trying to address your problem, which can help you really tap into a wider solution set. And so this divergent thinking is really a muscle that works directly against the grain of scientific management. And so for all of us that kind of grew up in a 20th century model, we have to actively try to flex this muscle. The second is leveraging something that many people probably aren't as familiar with, which is this idea called effectual logic. So in 2020, I published a paper with a colleague, Natalia Levina, where we examined how business schools are teaching entrepreneurship education. And we were interested in entrepreneurship because we know that entrepreneurship is a little different than teaching something like accounting or finance. It's hard to put your finger on it. And, not too much of a surprise, but when we looked at different programs, we found that many programs were replicating the same way of teaching entrepreneurship through the lens of scientific management. Okay, how do we quickly analyze and come up to solutions to develop a startup? But we did find several places that were doing some pretty unique things. And one of the most compelling is leveraging this idea called effectuation. Now, this is an evidence-based entrepreneurship method that we've learned from expert entrepreneurs. And so we've found actually through research that entrepreneurs don't kind of think the way everybody else does. Oftentimes you think you want to start a business. Let's say you want to start an ice cream stand. You say, okay, well, I need to get the location, I need to get the supplies, the ingredients, and I need to get the cones and the cups and get all the material together. So you have the end in mind and you go and gather the means. Well, it turns out actually expert entrepreneurs begin with the means. They think, okay, well, my family has a lot of experience in this. I'm really passionate about this. How can I take these means and imagine many different solutions that I might do with those particular means? So it's a means first approach. It's a what your resources first approach, and then imagining various solutions. And so I think both of these tools, this tool of divergent thinking and the tool of effectual logic, are things that we can easily practice in our work and apply to kind of get out of the rut of the outdated 20th century thinking. And over to you, Reima.
Thank you, Ashish. First of all, I'm honored to be filling in for Professor Phillips today, and I hope I do her piece in the article justice. I want to first start by unpacking the word inclusion. It's an intentional intervention that directly hinges on power, meaning someone has the power to include or exclude someone or groups of people because they have the power to do so. For me, historically, this has been a very uncomfortable notion, because when you think of it, wow, like I can actually exclude somebody, but that's a reality. And it's a remarkable reality, but also it points to that we have people in power have a responsibility. So inclusion refers to the actions taken to represent, welcome, and value people from all backgrounds, genders, sexual orientations, race, socioeconomic status, physical ability, and even neurodiversity. And let me even add to this, let people with different mental health challenges, because I think that's also important to take into account. And many large organizations, we see them adopting policies that are more inclusive of people of different backgrounds. But I think a key question to ask here is whether the ethos of inclusion is really sinking into business leaders and managers' decision-making. Is there a mindset shift regarding inclusion and how they manage, and why should managers even adopt this mindset? And I think a great example of this, I was looking at some case studies, and a great example of this was Google. Their managers embarked on a project to ask different questions as they were looking at what makes our product successful. Now, managers in the past would ask scientific management-based questions, as Professor Bhatia has illustrated to you, questions that maybe would have shown that the users of a particular product are males, for example, who have been racialized as white between the ages of 18 to 35. A manager runs a survey, what makes our product successful? He analyzes the data, or she analyzes the data, or they analyze the data, and it comes out it's a white male that's between the age of 18 to 35. So a product lead would then use this data to continue designing for that particular market segment. And the company would also use this data to perpetuate that cycle. However, what Google did is that they said, let's do something different. Let's ask different sets of questions that we usually wouldn't ask. So some of the questions were, do diverse perspectives produce more successful products? Do inclusive product design practices lead to positive business outcomes? Do companies that outwardly demonstrate a commitment to inclusive design practices see an increase in engagement from underrepresented users and majority users? The thing is, because for example, if managers were to follow scientific management-based questions to discover the qualities that make products more effective, the organization might continue to achieve only that type of success that it already had, right? It might simultaneously limit its potential to attract new customers or enter into a different market segment. And in my opinion, it's actually very stupid to do. If you're not asking those kinds of questions, you're leaving money on the table. Not only is inclusion good for the sake because people matter, right? It's the right thing to do. But regardless of that, if you're talking to folks and you're trying to get buy-in, it's actually you're leaving money on the table when you're not designing for all sorts of people and getting input from all different perspectives as you're doing this. So we really can't build, for people without understanding them, their needs, their preferences, and what disappoints and upsets them and makes them feel excluded. In addition to actually it being a moral outrage when you're not including people, racism, by the way, is an economic catastrophe. Citigroup data estimated that $16 trillion from the US GDP between year 2000 and year 2020 was lost due to racial discrimination. So just think about that for a minute. All right, so I think inclusion is a call to exercise intentional judgment. And with that, I will leave it to Professor Statler to take you through the third component of the article, which is qualitative judgment.
Thank you, Professor Shakeir, Reima. We share a lot of thoughts and commitments on this front. The thing that that you just cited, that city data about race, there's also really great a series of studies by McKinsey looking at gender diversity in management teams and boards of directors and racial diversity in management teams and boards of directors. And Ashish and Reima, you guys both know this. I'll get this slightly wrong, but I think they've done at least three, it was like 2015, 2017, and I think 19, maybe there's been another one since then. And in general, firms that have diverse executive teams and boards of directors outperform other firms in the same industry, in the same category by a margin of like 25 or 30%. So you talk about leaving money on the table. The cost of racism, the cost of sexism is at that scale. It's significant. I think in the 2017 study, what they then started to consider was like, well, we've had this data has been out in the public since then. I mean, for the last 3 or 4 years at least, and yet firms are not effectively diversifying, right, or including those other voices and perspectives in the management teams and in the executive boards, which is then economically irrational, right? If we know that like sexism and racism cost us money and still we can't evolve beyond it, then why is that, right? So that's then what I would say about sort of my approach to this. And here I'm going to sort of honor Ronald and Ashish, you guys talking about being at Stern, at a certain time and being born at a certain time. Well, I'm 51 years old, and when I got my PhD, I studied ancient Greek philosophy. So forget about 20th century thinking. I've got like 3rd century BC thinking is my kind of baseline set of assumptions there. And I say that to say I finished my PhD in philosophy, and then what my father had predicted came true, which was that I could not find a job as a philosopher. There was no one who wanted to hire a Nietzschean Platonist to teach philosophy. So I became a management consultant at A.T. Kearney. And then at that time, that's late 90s, early 2000s, when you guys were in school, all of the big consulting firms, the consultants were all trying to get out to go into the first dot-com wave where the upside was greater. So I became a dot-com entrepreneur. Just as that wave then started to crash, right? So we hired 50 of our friends and then had to fire them, 10 months later. And what did I do? I was trained to facilitate, Ashish, to your point, a play-based strategy process called Lego Serious Play. that had been invented at a think tank in Switzerland. So then I moved there and spent 4 years playing with Lego bricks with strategy teams, doing scenario planning and building out, Lego models of organizations in their competitive landscapes. We found ourselves asking the question of what happens when people in management teams play well together. And our research led us to the notion that basically you're more adaptive and flexible in response to unexpected and emergent change, right? So the point about the VUCA world, why would you want to play in a VUCA world? It's because play trains the imaginative and creative capacities, that are required to respond when something volatile, uncertain, complex, or ambiguous presents itself to you. So we wrote a book on disaster preparedness, right? So let's look at people who deal with unexpected circumstances every day on the job. This is post 2001, so there was a lot of money and a lot of interest flowing into what the 9/11 Commission called the failure of imagination, right? What happened on 9/11? It was a failure of imagination. That was the 9/11 Commission report. So, which means that all of the quantitative risk management scenarios and parameters are themselves predicated on a qualitative judgment about what is possible or what is reasonable. And then within the parameters of that qualitative judgment, then you crunch the numbers and find tail risks and find the things, make hedging bets, decisions about what to do or what not to do. So I was in that role as director. You introduced me this way. Thank you. And again, Reima, I'm also very honored to be here. I must say, I have the occasion to say that. Thank you so much for inviting us to be with you all today. I was in that role as director of research for the Center for Catastrophe Preparedness, and this job that I now still have 13 years later came open. And when I started, again, this is in 2009, in that fall, what I was then told by Dean Sally Blount, who had hired me to do this job, this director of social impact and business ethics for the undergraduate college, that there was a group of researchers who had been studying the field of undergraduate business education post-2008 financial crisis, asking what can we teach and how can we teach it in order to update our thinking. And the response to what they had found then was basically that we needed to keep the scientific management, keep the instrumental rationality, the economic assumptions, but to blend those and to twine those together. The metaphor that they used was a double helix, DNA double helix, twine those together with the humanities and the liberal arts. Business students, yes, need to have the quant skills, but they also need to read history. They also need to read philosophy. They need to read literature. They need to be familiar with arts and aesthetics and play and all of those types of things. And by weaving the qualitative and the quantitative judgments, skills, capacities for judgment together, we then will, this is the idea, this is the hope, we train business students who are what I would call practically wise. They're not just smart, they're wise. They're capable of using the intelligence, not just to do something just because you can, but to decide whether you should or not, to make those moral and ethical judgments about whether this is the right thing to do, right? So that's, again, sort of a little bit of my story. I got lucky and joined Stern at a time when that was happening. And what I would say is that the last 13 years have just only further illustrated the importance of that. I'll say one more quick thing, and then I think maybe we, back to my colleagues, or open up for questions. The other thing that has happened in the last 10 years, as I alluded to earlier, is the growth of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. So that's where all of the quantitative judgments, right? If there is a right answer, to a question, one single right answer. If there is an optimization solution to a portfolio management, to a market entry, like anything, if there is a right answer, then sooner or later, somebody's going to create an algorithm that's going to find it faster than any of us could find it, right? So automation is then a thing out there in the world that everybody's interested in and sometimes struggling with and sometimes benefiting from. From the perspective of a business school, or from the perspective of somebody who wants to learn a way of thinking about business, you've got to outrun the robots. You've got to think in ways that cannot be automated. If you want to remain relevant in your job, if you want to remain engaged in the world, the idea that you would only think thoughts which lend themselves to single right answers, you're sadly then consigning yourself to obsolescence. I mean, the robots are going to catch up to you and eat your job for lunch sooner or later. So that's then the other really pragmatic, from a professional education perspective, as an educator, to tell students, you've got to make sure to be able to think creatively in a nonlinear way, in a qualitative way, in an imaginative way. And in order to do that, you need to read history. You need to look at the arts. You need to talk to people who are different from you. You need to be mindful and intentional about, yes, using your power to include people who are different from you, and remain humble about your own, sort of identity and power in a way that allows you to continue to learn and evolve. So I'll stop on that. Reima, Ashish, maybe back to you. It looks like we're soliciting questions in the chat and Q&A box.
I think we turn it back to Ronald.
Sure. Well, maybe I could come up with the first question for Matt. I'm so glad that you talk about your studies in Greek mythology or Greek literature, because when I was a freshman, sophomore at NYU, I took a lot of classes at College of Art and Science. And I must tell you, I spent enormous hours reading Greek literature, especially the Iliad, the Odyssey. And I still vividly remember how much time I spent in writing about Odysseus, who has this mental and physical flexibility in his journey back home. And this is, again, the kind of quality we need in the 21st century, by being flexible. I still remember this Greek word, achieving arete, excellence. And excellence requires a lot of flexibility and adaptability. And I'm also glad to hear that you're an expert in Lego serious play, because I have been a part of that play for several times. But one thing I found challenging is, after doing all these exercises, people are not ready, not willing, and not able to change. How do we encourage people so that they are ready, willing, and able to change? Change is challenging and difficult. How do we together encourage people to change? What are some methods to empower them?
Great question, Ronald. Thank you so much for that. The point about Odysseus, I think it's ho anthropos polytropos, like the many-sided man, the many-faceted man. That's how the Odyssey begins, with an affirmation of that, and indeed that capacity to change. Polytropos, to change the shape or to change form, is very important, precisely in a volatile, uncertain world. Now, to Ashish's earlier point, is managing a business today any more or less volatile or uncertain than sailing a small boat across a choppy sea to fight demons and well, maybe not. That we can sort of pose that as a broader question, but where you ended the question and Lego series play, we used to call that early in the Lego series play, we would call that the Monday morning syndrome, right? You go off site, you do your weekend of Lego serious play, and everybody feels good and happy and playful. And then Monday morning starts and it's just back down to the same old way of thinking and grinding through. So I would offer two responses to your question, how to cultivate that. The first is it just take it when I'm talking about qualitative judgment, I'm talking about a habit. It's not a one and it's not a single event in time. It's not like like some sort of mechanical function. It's an embodied practice or habit that needs to be cultivated over many iterations. So to do it once, to do it twice, well, that's going to feel good. But to make it then a way of life requires repeated engagement, iterative development, habituation over time. So that's the first thing, just to acknowledge that if you want to engage imaginatively, you got to work at it. It takes time. Now, then the other piece of it, I think, that is relevant to the point of power in organizational contexts is people have to, the leadership has to be committed to the development of those imaginative and inclusive and qualitative skills over time. Too often people think, well, I got to play on that offsite retreat, but now I'm back at the job and the boss is expecting me to do, produce my quarterly results. And I'm not saying quarterly results are a bad thing, but the culture of organizations is often not conducive to the cultivation of playful and imaginative judgment. So that's then a question for leadership of setting the tone that it's okay to play, it's okay to be creative, it's okay to be fluid, polytropos in a variety of ways. And that is then something which can't just be talk, but also has to be, walked. The leadership has to, embody and embrace those practices, those habits in a way to give other people then the freedom to think that they can cultivate it for themselves in their own ways. Ashish, your Zoom hand just went up. I'll hand the word to you.
It's such a good question that I wanted to jump in on that as well. I would echo my colleague's comment regarding repetition, building that habit and cultivating that habit. And this is something we struggle with our students, and we all struggle within our workplaces. As Professor Statler points out, you go away on this meaningful trip, right? So I think one thing that he said there that we need to recognize is to get that kind of mind shift, right? One of the things we do in entrepreneurship is you need people to experience. They actually have to take action and then reflect on that action in a way that you recognize that your mind has shifted. And so a lot of traditional business classes say, oh, let's analyze what we're going to do and then take action based on that analysis. Well, sometimes you got to flip that around. Well, let's go out and take some action and see what we can learn about that action that we took, but also from what we learn about ourselves. So key point is taking action, reflecting, I think are really important things. And one example of that I saw in my own workplace, you mentioned that I worked at the New York Fed. And when I was there, Tim Geithner was the head of the New York Fed. And one of the practices that he did, and I got to experience it during the financial crisis, we had a long table. We all had to give updates during the financial crisis of what was going on. I actually covered Japan at that time. And, he spoke last. He said, I want everyone to tell me what's going on. And we all got to speak. And he was really careful not to speak because he knew that when he would talk, it would kill the conversation, right? He would say, oh, well, I'm familiar with this. And then, well, then why would you say anything as someone that wasn't a leader? And we noticed that it was a big transition when we had other leadership. that did it the opposite way, that would say, these are the things I'm concerned about. This is what I know. Now tell me the things I don't know. It immediately reduced the level of conversation, the level of new ideas that were generated from junior people, right? You want your junior people to tell you stuff? Well, create systems in your meetings that allow them, encourage them to share before you even bring in your ideas. And it looks like my colleague, Professor Shakeir, also wants to add to this.
Absolutely. Two things. So I have my biases as well. So something practical that I do for myself is I spend 30 minutes a day listening to a news agency that I completely disagree with and that I detest, actually. I don't like them at all, but I do take that time. And because I do recognize that I'll be in spaces where there's people that actually align with that point of view, right? And it takes me time to reflect and think about why do they think the way they think and how can I be more inclusive of them in these spaces. Second thing, and Professor Statler hit upon that, is about leadership. Now, I myself have been a beneficiary of leaders in organizations, and this is when we think about exercise of power. Some of you in these organizations have power more than others, and you have the power to stick your neck out for somebody that is diverse, that has maybe a radical point of view, because people in the organization will have more bandwidth for you to accept that. And I'll share a quick example of that. When I was applying for the Edmund de Rothschild Foundation's position, now I was up against a group of, again, it was males, very suit and boot, top-notch business schools. I didn't go to a business school. My background was in English literature, and then later on I did the program that Professor Bhatia did, which is higher education management, as my doctoral degree. It took a person in that room when we were interviewing, and I was sitting and I was seeing the profiles walking in and out of that door. It took a person in that room to say, no, I want her. Now, she took some time to get the colleagues to align, but that's exactly what happened. And I think many of us in these spaces have that power to think about, all right, like these are the kinds of profiles that are coming in. Who's not being heard? Who can I take a chance on? That's all I have to say about that.
Well, thank you so much. You know, what I always say to my friends and colleagues is, a lot of times us as analysts and investors, we predict the future, but entrepreneurs and together, human beings create the future. So stop predicting the future, but instead creating the future. And that is why value comes in for mankind. And so, I mean, when it comes to imagination, inclusion, and qualitative judgment, I just wonder, talk is easy. If we really want to polish up on these three aspects, any resources and materials that you would recommend the audience and ourselves to read up on, any particular materials that really help you to come up with those three key words?
Well, while we gather our thoughts on the specifics, I want to just echo something you said there, Ronald. I think that this is a point that I often emphasize in my courses, which is, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of scientific management is it's a powerful tool for prediction. And to be clear, so that there's no confusion, we endorse the tool. It's a very valuable tool. We wouldn't have had the vaccine development that we had in the last few years. We won't have air travel. We won't have all sorts of important things without science and scientific management. So it's something we critically need, but it has its limitations. And as you said, Ronald, there's some things that we can do a pretty good job of predicting, and we need more clear data sets from the past, and we can interpret what potentially is going to happen in the future. But the thing about entrepreneurship, and I think leaders in general, is that they need to be able to work in areas where it's much more unknown, right, or unknowable, right? So we can, prediction helps us with uncertainty or some things where there's, probability. But when you're dealing with something that's unknowable, what's, for example, what is going to be the next personal device that we all carry, right? We went from a kind of flip phone to the smartphone. We have Apple Watches. What's the next device look like, right? And some people are imagining that maybe it's a pair of glasses, or I think I just saw there's some embedded chip now that you can get to make payments from your hand. That solution, the solution of what we use next, is not something that you can go and run some spreadsheets on to solve. You have to imagine something. We have to dream it up. And as my colleagues have pointed out, literature, humanities, these are places where we can dream. And so, to your point about what helps us, resources that folks can follow. One thing that, again, I think I might have introduced a new word to many of the people here today. This idea of effectuation. So there's actually a website, effectuation. I think it's .org, and you could even just search what makes entrepreneurs entrepreneurial, and you'll find this outstanding article that really highlights from a professor at UVA Darden, Saraswati, about this idea of beginning with your means, who you are, what you know, and who you know, as a way to imagine forward ways that you can create the future as opposed to predict it.
I have one question here. We're in this COVID, the third year already. Would any component of your findings or conclusion be any different had we not had COVID?
I mean, yes and no, Alan. I mean, in the sense that, like, COVID, this experience, no one alive has ever lived through these years like we have all. Thank goodness. I look at you. We are alive. No one has ever had this experience. And so, in one sense, it changes everything. It changes things on a personal level, like recognizing, if you didn't need a reminder, life doesn't go on forever. And then, so what is important, and what do you place value on in your life for yourself, for your loved ones? Talking about wishing that your kids see the next century, of course, right? It changes everything. At an organizational level, at a macroeconomic level, just ongoing. So how long will these supply chain disruptions continue? There's anybody's guess how long the effects of the COVID pandemic will continue to be felt. So yes. And then at the same time, as Ashish, I think you said early, no, in the sense that, like, this is just a tragic illustration of the reality of a VUCA world, and of a history of business education which has been oriented toward the world almost exclusively as a scientific or mathematical problem to be solved. And it just gives us the occasion to illustrate and emphasize. And yet there's all kinds of other things that we need to be thinking about too. And math is necessary, but not sufficient to think about those things. Reima, your hand's up. I'll hand the word back to you.
Yes, on the topic of COVID, Alan, COVID has forced a lot of institutions, organizations, corporations to show their hand. There's no going back, because suddenly when COVID hits, you hear words being thrown by institutions, even educational ones, that you wouldn't hear before. Compassion instead of compliance. Suddenly I'm hearing these words and I'm like, oh, really? Every student, every kid gets a laptop. The ones that didn't have access before, suddenly those are available. They were gold right before COVID hit. You couldn't get a laptop to a economically disadvantaged kid. It was a whole process, but suddenly there's laptops for everyone. Teachers, we're asked teachers, we want you to be creative in how you conduct your classes. And suddenly teachers were actually coming back into their role of what they were supposed to do. because teachers now have been unfortunately shoved into the space of being classroom managers, right? So there was this amount of trust that was given to people. Families, we need you to co-collaborate with us. Schools, universities, institutions, to help us see kids through this phase, right? So suddenly there was more trust and actually seeing and hearing people. And what I want to say is that it shouldn't take a pandemic to recognize people's humanity. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, this reminds me of a line from reading a book by Tim Geithner. He said, don't let a good crisis go into waste, and use this moment to make changes and to do things better. I think that was kind of something he talked about in his book back in 08, 09. I forgot the name of the book, but anyway, I remember that line very vividly when he said that. I don't know if he really said that, but anyway. So I guess this.
We have one question from on the box from Masini Gao.
Okay, yeah. So, Ellen, you want to read it out?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Thank you all for sharing the insights. I've got one question on embracing diversity and understanding people who are different from us. People normally seek for equally smart and like-minded people to work with. How do you think this particular mindset lives with the mindset of embracing diversity and adapting to people who are very different from us? Are these two mindsets contradictory? How should we cope?
I would like to respond to that, and I would like to respond to it in a way that weaves in a response, Ronald, to your previous question about are there particular resources that we can draw on, and I think that to respond to the question in the chat, I mean, the two mindsets need not be contradictory. It is possible to hold those two seemingly or intuitively contradictory approaches simultaneously in mind to balance those, to allow the complexity in your own mind to rise up to meet or mirror the complexity in the world. There are different mindsets out there. Now, what does it take for us to become, to embrace that? As we said earlier, it's a matter of practice. And we just have to practice that, and to do it intentionally and mindfully and repeatedly over time, recognizing that it's not, again, something that you do once and then you've done it and now it's over. You've got to kind of, like, as Reima, you said, like, if it's every day for 30 minutes a day, actively putting yourself in the shoes, in dialogue with somebody who disagrees with you. Again, it's our colleague Jonathan Haidt at NYU Stern, whom all of you should know his work. If you don't know, I mean, the problem that social media confronts us with is that it has a tendency to give, oh, you like red stuff? Have some more red stuff. You like blue stuff? Have some more blue stuff. And so it has the tendency of polarizing our kind of world, so that we don't ever have to then confront someone who likes stuff that's a different color or a different flavor than what we like, and we then tend to dehumanize rather than recognize the fundamental humanity, Reima, as you suggested. And again, it took a pandemic for many institutions to sort of like wake up to and pivot and recognize that. But back, Ronald, to your question, and I know our time is going short here, so I'll be brief about this. There is no end to the number of resources, the range of resources. You just have to open your mind, read history, visit galleries and museums, whatever you're passionate about. It could be food. You could, intentionally cultivate a capacity for reflective judgment just on the different character of different varieties of ginger alone. A rigorous study, a cultivation of that is incredibly fun and illuminating. And it's nonlinear, so you can draw lessons from what you learned about ginger to what you then, the judgment that you exercise with respect to your colleagues, with respect to your, again, investment decisions, all the rest of it. So lots of opportunity. We don't need a pandemic. We don't need a pandemic. There's lots of opportunity to learn how to cultivate these capacities.
So it's really a multidisciplinary approach that I guess we should all strive for. And I remember it's called kind of lattice work, how things can come together and be flexible with the different and various disciplines that we should read and learn about to come up with new solutions. I understand we are drawing to a close. It's already 9:01 a.m. in New York, and it's been an hour of sharing. So I just want to double check if anyone still have any question. If not, I think we will begin to draw to a close. Alan, do you have any final question for the professors?
I'm okay. I learned a lot. There's a lot of information to digest tonight. Thanks a lot for joining the call and all the alumni around Asia. Thank you for joining.
Right. And so thank you so much, professors, for joining this evening time for us here in Asia and morning time for you in New York. And if you do come to Asia, give us a shout. We would love to host you, whether in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, you name it, we'll be there for you. And in the meantime, when we visit New York, we'll definitely look you up and see if there's anything we could discuss and debate further. So once again, thank you so much for joining this session, and hope everyone will have a good week ahead. And thank you so much. Good evening and good morning.
Thank you very
See you
much.
later.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye.
It's been a pleasure.